Hello, everybody. Mark Schaftlein with you, and this is the Schaftlein Report. We're going to cover everything. We're going to cut through all the propaganda, give it to you straight from left, right, and center. The opinions are what counts.
Hello, everybody. Mark Schaftlein with you, and this is the Schaftlein Report. We're going to dive into everything U.S., Iran, Israel, oil prices, markets. And an interesting thing is developing, folks, right now. Which side can absorb the most pain in this deal? Okay, the president has said that effectively we've already won, but again, attacks are continuing. Initially, when this started, it was announced it was going to be a 4-week campaign. So we're only in week 2 of it right now. But oil, which spiked to almost $120 a barrel, is sitting here right now between $86 and $89 a barrel. Question is, okay, is that because the International Energy Agency decided to release 20 million a day for 20 days? That's 400 million barrels of oil they agreed to release. That's about a quarter of their stockpile of 1.2 billion barrels left after dispersal. So think about this. They had 1.6 billion barrels. They're going to release 400 million. That process has started. It's about 20 million a day. That's the shortfall that's not coming through the strait at this time, the Strait of Hormuz. So the Iranians threatened to go out there and lay landmines. Well, what was the U.S. response? They knocked out 16 Iranian ships that can lay those landmines. Now, while I'm watching this unfold, just like all of you are, and you're seeing it, seeing all these strikes, I'm going to tell you one thing, folks. These ships cost to lay these mines are a hell of a lot less than what those missiles cost. So we're spending an inordinate amount of money to knock these out. We have to do it. I'm just pointing out sort of the obvious to you here. So how is this energy market and the war, why is it, tied in? Well, it's obviously tied in because there's virtually no activity going through the Strait of Hormuz right now. Now, the Iranians are gradually selling some of their oil to China. That's getting through. But any of those ships, they're not. And there have been ships attacked. Now, the U.S. response to this was to try to effectively create an insurance market because nobody could get insurance anymore. And only a handful of the tankers were willing to take that risk. You've got a tanker, you're going to be sending it through there uninsured? Probably not. So what's been the effect on the markets? The average price of gasoline has gone up to $3.55 in this country, up about 55 cents since the war began. Some places on the left coast, $6 a gallon is back to being the norm. 5.5, 6, 6.5. In some cases, 7. Boy, people would freak out back east if they had those prices. So the question is, and I'm going to raise it to everybody watching, this show, okay, who is going to absorb more pain? The Iranians are threatening destruction in the strait, which they claim could send oil prices to $200 a barrel and wreak havoc with the global economy. The United States is saying that's not going to happen because us and the Israelis control the skies over Iran. We're going to be able to escort tankers, get them through the strait. But here's the thing. The strait is, we'll call it Iranian territory. Again, Iran's on one side, Oman's on the other. But to get to the Gulf of Oman, you got to go through the Strait of Hormuz to get to the wider area. So who's going to give? What's going to give? And you're seeing a lot of commentators basically saying, well, how do we get out of this? Well, again, President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have both said we'll get out of it when we're ready to get out of it. And again, I'm going back to what was said in the initial days. I don't want us to forget about that. Both governments claimed this was going to be a 4-week campaign. We're only in week 2. So the probability of pain in the economy is going to go on. But there is a bright side to this. Yeah, you had oil prices spike up, they came back down. Okay, the IEA, International Energy Agency, obviously that helped. But if these resolution does come in about a month, as the Trump administration initially claimed. Now, what's the definition of winning the war? Well, it's sort of ambiguous, to be honest with you. Is it stopping the Iranians from gaining nuclear weapons? Well, I think you're pretty well there on that one right now. Is it regime change? No, we're nowhere near on regime change. Even though 80% of the people in Iran support ousting the regime, it hasn't happened. And the idea that people were going to be out on the streets right away, well, that isn't happening either. And Trump basically told everybody for the first week, don't come out. Well, they couldn't come out if they wanted to right now. Iranian security forces are patrolling the streets. People are staying inside because bombs are still being dropped. So you're not having that uprising because, there's been really no opportunity for that uprising. So we're unsure what the end game is here. Now, let's look at support here in the United States. Initially, when the war was launched, it had support of 52% of Americans voters. Now, based upon probably 10 polling outfits, sort of like presidential politics, if you will, it's sort of a divide. The latest numbers we have, which we're willing to share, are roughly 44, 45% approval, roughly 48, 49% disapproval. A little bit of a shift from when it first started. Why? Well, people are feeling higher prices at the pump. That's why. And other things went up in cost. Airline tickets, insurance rates. We talk about oil. Natural gas is not getting through the straits either. So there's going to be, shall I say, either an escalation on the part of the U.S. and the Israelis, or come 4 weeks, something's going to have to come to a halt. Because I don't think the economies of the West are going to tolerate, oil prices maybe up to 100. I think you can tolerate it okay. But when you go north of there, I think that becomes problematic. So then what happens with the conflict at that point? We don't know. We don't know if oil prices are going to go back to 100. I tell you, they've been all over the map. Think about it, folks. In the course of a week, they had a high of 120 and a low of 78. That's a gigantic move. Now, the president claimed the war is very complete, while bombs were continuing to drop on Iran. I think he did that to try to calm the markets a little bit, and he had some success with it. So success on one hand is great, but there's got to be a clear, concise message coming out also. And I think there's some critique of the president and the administration being, what is the strategy here? Now, I think when you step back and think about what's happened over the past couple months, I think there's a clear strategy here. Maybe they didn't intend it this way, but I think they thought it out. This just wasn't, for example, in Venezuela, an effort to get Maduro out. It was an effort to control the oil. And Iran, in my view, again, preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon was stated goal number 1. Stated goal number 2 was regime change. You change the regime, you can have some influence over the oil coming out of Iran. And then where's most of that oil go? China. Who had influence in Venezuela? China. Trump's going to be meeting with Xi next month. So again, the support among the American public right now is slightly better than Trump's approval numbers. Meaning, if you like Trump, you probably approve of it. If you don't like Trump, you probably don't approve of it. Now, there have been casualties. We've lost 7 Americans. We've had 140 wounded, and 8 of those wounded were serious. So this is not coming without a cost. Global equities had a significant amount of value wiped out as a result of this. Now, markets tend to bounce back. That is true. I mean, you're sitting here, the Dow hit 50,000 a month ago. We're still sitting at 47 and change. The S&P is within 4% of its all-time high. So while there's been some adjustments, it hasn't been what I would deem to be a fallout. I mean, certainly not in a bear market, but economic uncertainty and the reality of hitting up with the insurance industry in the Gulf, that is playing right in front of us right now. So, you've got 1.2 billion barrels still available at the IEA. Markets are fearing stagflation if oil remains near these levels, meaning, you have high inflation rates and stagnant growth. That's not a good economic story. Now, the inflation numbers came out for February, and they're pretty much as expected. They stayed relatively flat, 2.4%, somewhat elevated over the 2% goal, but they didn't get worse. Some costs actually went down. Certain housing costs went down. Prices of certain food staples went down. Used cars went down. I mean, overall 2.4, that's a number you can live with, but still elevated. So, clearly there's support for the war at home, but it's equally as not support. So, the administration's going to have to continue making their case here because there has been some slippage, and that's to be expected. So, from a geopolitical point of view, the Iranians, obviously they have planned for this. Now, they didn't plan on losing their top 50 leaders, guarantee you that. But the Ayatollah, the former Ayatollah Khamenei's son, has been appointed the supreme leader. Folks, it is not that he hasn't spoken about anything yet or put any policies out. I mean, there's a bounty on this guy's head, just like there was on his dad. So I think he's going to be rather cautious about location, commentary, and supposedly he has this super armed guard corps around him, but that didn't do his dad a lot of good either. So I don't expect to hear much from his son, who is now the, quote, supreme leader. But obviously you have missiles being launched from Iran still. You still have drones. And again, the attacks are less frequent. So the U.S. is correct, and the Israelis, in stating that they believe every day that supply dwindles. Now, that maybe they underestimated the drones. That's possible. But the fact is, attacks are lessened. But it only takes one major catastrophe or one major hit. And again, that could send global markets in a tailspin. Everything from insurance costs to you name it. It's a volatile situation, and that's one we're going to have to deal with. So we'll see what the administration's plan is. I guarantee they've thought it through. The military planners have. And don't believe the crap when you hear some Democrats say, well, they're changing policy every day. That's baloney. They're adjusting, obviously. But again, when you map out the war games, you don't just do it for a week. Okay, we're going to take about a 30-second break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the other implications, other things happening beyond oil and beyond the war, because there are implications and they're widespread. Be back shortly.
AI is everywhere, but none of it does everything. Until now, meet Real Intelligence, RI, the one AI that does it all better. It generates cinema-quality 4K videos, unreal images, and award-worthy music, all in one platform. RI even writes code and handles advanced research at your command. No more juggling multiple apps or settling for less. Your creativity deserves one powerhouse. Real intelligence, better at everything, all in one place. Try RI now for free at tryrinow.com.
And we're back. Okay, we had mentioned that the U.S. sank 16 boats capable of mining the Strait of Hormuz. We don't know if they have more boats capable of doing that. I would guess they probably would. Okay, but the Iranians were successful in striking 3 ships, and like we told you before the break, if you're on the offensive, which they are, you only have to have a handful of successes to create havoc. And with the Iranian goal of inflicting as much pain on the region, bear in mind their revenues are drying up because they're not able to export their prime commodity. And if prices really spike, I'm not talking to 100, I'm talking 150, 200, then the question will come up, how much of this are we willing to take? And will the U.S. continue to apply that pressure? So you have a situation here. The Iranians successful in striking 3 ships. The U.S. successful in taking out 16 boats capable of laying mines. So this is ongoing, and it's not going to stop. And on a daily basis, with oil fluctuating as widely as it is, the markets are calm now because countries are tapping their strategic reserves. And, we just had that 400 million barrel release. But here's something that's not happening. We briefly alluded to this, in the first segment. No demonstrations or protesters are out on the streets. You may think, why? We gave them what they wanted. Well, you've got security forces armed, patrolling those streets every day, and people are staying inside, as Trump said they should, to avoid bombings. Now, no, civilian targets are not being bombed, but when you see bombs go off on industrial areas, military targets, could be a stray. You never know. You're not going to want to be out protesting and have a bunch of protesters killed. Well, right now, you're still seeing evidence of the Iranian guards out on the streets patrolling. They've got the guns and the bullets. As we learned back in January 7th, 8th, the protesters then did not, and they were slaughtered, 20 to 30,000 of them, by the former regime, who their leadership's gone too. And here's another interesting paradox going on here in the States. Some people on the left, or I should say leaning left, as an example, Joe Scarborough used to be a Republican, now he sort of leans the Democratic way. I don't want to say highly, but praising the administration, on the action in Iran. Whereas we have some MAGA Republicans or some conservative leaning criticizing Trump, saying, well, he broke his campaign promise. Both can be true at the same time, ironically. He did say that, and yet here we are. And yet the end game, he wouldn't have done it unless he felt the end game was worth it. So, some on the left supporting Trump, some on the right against him. That's a strange situation that we have. But needless to say, Trump did tell us in the early on it was going to go on for at least 4 weeks. So we're in week 2, folks. Week 2. We've got superiority over the skies, but Iran still has weapons. And ultimately, when you say, well, what's the end game here? We don't know that. Will the Ayatollah's son remain in power? I mean, that was made crystal clear early on. No, that was not going to be acceptable. What does that mean? You got to take him out and get somebody else in? Maybe. This is not like Venezuela. Venezuela's been a resounding success. The head of the country, they're exporting oil. Relations with the U.S. are reasonable. Haven't had to send any more troops in there. No more military action. That's not going to be the case here with the Iranians. Now, let's look domestically, some of the fallout from this. Look, we believe it or not, folks, and you may find it hard to believe, we still have a partial government shutdown going in. Yes, we do. Shocking. The Democratic Party has orchestrated this. They're wanting to implement changes in ICE. Well, I don't know what kind of better changes you could get. The head of ICE is, ICE Barbie Kristi Noem is gone. Mark Wayne Mullen, pending confirmation, he'll be confirmed by the Senate. Tom Homan has implemented significant changes, and yet they're still holding it up. Why? Political reasons. TSA workers are not being paid. If you're traveling, you see some of those massive lines? Some airports, no problem. You zip right through. I was traveling. I remember a week or so ago, I zipped right through, no problem. But in other areas, you see where it's taking 2, 3, and 4 hours, 5 hours to get through security. That's insane. They've got to get a resolution on this so that these long lines at these airports stop. Bear in mind, too, FEMA, we've had some storms, caused some damage. Democrats are holding up this package. They seem to want to use this as their weapon of choice. Just like the Iranians want to inflict conflict on the global economy, inflict pain on the global economy, the Democrats want to inflict pain on the American citizens by making them wait long lines in airports and not have funds to pay TSA personnel and not have funds to pay FEMA. What about the Coast Guard? That, honest to goodness, folks, no wonder the Democratic approval's in the toilet. And we're going to get into that in a minute. But this has got to get worked out here. Now, another thing that's sort of floating around out there in the ether is the Save America Act. That's stuck in the Senate. That's the one that's voter ID and you get no more mail-in ballots. Look, folks, in some states, mail-in ballots work great. Never had a problem. State of Florida, prime example, and others. But again, it does not, as of today, look like they're going to do the standing filibuster. Looks like John Thune's going to take a vote. The vote will go down. It'll fail. So it doesn't appear to me there's going to be any standing filibuster. That's going to piss conservatives off something you know what. And again, you're not going to be able to break filibuster. So that bill doesn't look like it's going anywhere. Hate to say that, but that's just sort of the reality where we are. Now, back on this thing about, the Democratic Party. Folks, both parties are upside down. The Democratic Party is horrific. Voters approve of Democrats 30%, disapprove 52%. Now, Republicans are better, but not by a whole lot. 37% approval of Republicans, 51% no. But here's the interesting thing. On the generic ballot, whether you just want a generic Republican or a generic Democrat, Democrats are leading by 4 to 6%. A lot of that is the energy from the anti-Trump vote that Democrats absolutely loathe him. But he's upside down with independents now 2-1. In other words, he's got like 30% approval, 60% disapproval. That's down. When he won election, I think his approval was like 45% among independents, 46, maybe 47. That's got to improve. Folks, if that does not improve, there's going to be some big problems in the midterm elections. No doubt about it. Now, the president's overall approval is floating around 46% approval, 53% not approval. I know in some polls he's down there lower, 40, 41, 42, but on average, it's about 46. When you average all those polling numbers, he's about the same as where Obama was at this point in his presidency. Same with George Bush. Less than a point difference between them. But this independent thing, folks, is a problem. So let's try to, tie this all together here. We're waging a war in Iran. Energy prices have spiked. Markets have come down a little bit. inflation's roughly the same right now. But if this prices continue and oil stays between $85 and $100 a barrel, inflation prices will tick up. Already on Wall Street, the probability of a second rate cut is less than 50%. Kevin Warsh, once he gets confirmed, he's going to have his hands full here. Believe me. So, while all that's going on, and you say, Mark, there can't be more. Yeah, well, there is. Quietly behind the scenes, and I can say that because, you know, the president and Marco Rubio and a lot of the administration was just down at Doral, South Florida, at a conference of the Americas. And there was some chatter going on about a potential deal in the works with Cuba, an economic deal. Well, think about this. The Cubans were getting their oil from the Venezuelans. They're not getting it now. One thing that could really help the United States, if there was an economic deal worked out with the Cubans, excuse me, that could be a very, very nice situation. Now, there's a lot of Cuban Americans, particularly in Dade County, some of the most entrepreneurial people you'll ever meet. I've worked for years. Used to have an office right down there by Doral. Heavy concentration Venezuelans, Cubans, Cuban Americans, Venezuelans. And I think that will, if the president and his economic team and his negotiators work out an agreement with the Cuban government, bear in mind, there's been no relationship with the United States and Cuba for a long time, folks. That would be a breakthrough. Now, we'll have to see what that plays out to be. I mean, the president has his hands pretty full right now in Iran. But don't kid yourself. There are discussions going on with the Cubans, and there has been since the action took place in Venezuela. So, from this commentator's perspective, I'm very optimistic right now. You might say, how can you be optimistic in the middle of a war? Well, I think strategically, Trump and Netanyahu, when it gets to a point where they're satisfied that they've accomplished what they can, I think they will declare victory. Now, will that come before regime change? That, to me, is the $64,000 question. Don't know the answer to that. Probably not. If this guy has gone into a fortified bunker and is laying low, it may be difficult to get him out, but who knows? Did you ever think you'd knock out the top 50 leadership in Iran in one day? Probably not. So, other reasons I'm optimistic. Oil prices may spike, but I think if there's a resolution within that 4-week time period, prices will come back down, markets will rally, inflation will come down. That's how I see the tea leaves playing out. But will there be a little bit of short-term pain? I think there could be. But I don't think the global economy is going to tolerate a closure of the strait. And I believe the U.S. military, working with the countries in the Gulf, will ultimately come up with a solution for this. And the Iranians obviously trying to save face. In the long term, it would be in their economic interest to work out a deal with the West. It's tough to work out a deal when you're dropping bombs on each other. But I think ultimately, whether we have regime change or not, if the nuclear capabilities, which do look like they've been severely curtailed, if there can be an olive branch accepted by the Iranians for some type of security guarantees, you could have some economic gain. Anyhow, it's going to play itself out, but from my perspective, I do see more opportunity. There's obviously huge risk involved, but with risk, that opportunity comes. All right, folks, thanks for watching today. We'll keep you abreast of all the news. Stay with Patriot TV. Stay with Schaftlein Report. We'll see you soon.
Sadie, why don't more people know about the health benefits of Glucodown soluble fiber? That it lowers blood sugar, especially after meals? Glucodown
Glucodown drink mixes are enriched with soluble fiber for healthy blood sugar. It's diabetic-friendly nutrition, and it's clinically proven.
Glucodown's clinically proven soluble fiber helps maintain blood sugar in a healthy range, especially after meals.
Glucodown is a game changer.
Keep your blood sugar healthy. Try all 8 flavors of Glucodown.
Available at Amazon or in the diabetic care aisle at your local pharmacy.